I would like to call into order the Southborough School Committee special open meeting for Wednesday, October 27th, 2021. The time is 6:02 p.m. All members of Southborough School Committee are in attendance.
And I'll call the meeting for the Town of Southborough's Capital Planning Committee - School Research Subcommittee to order. And I'll note that myself and Ms. Martin are present, and Ms. Cook will be joining us at some point during the discussion.
Great. So I think the first item on the agenda is the demography presentation. I'll turn that over to you, Greg, to actually move into that. I see Bob online.
Sure.
Hi, Bob.
So just a little bit of context. The Town Capital Planning Committee, School Research Subcommittee has been studying the school facilities and looking at potential configuration options. And as part of the School Research Committee's work, we commissioned 2 demographic reports. One we received from NESDEC. NESDEC presented its findings in the winter of last year. And then we commissioned RLS Demographics Incorporated to do a second demographic study. And here this evening is Bob Scartamalia to present his demographic study and answer any questions the committee members may have. And for this evening, I will be driving for Bob. So Bob, you'll have to just give me the signal to turn the slide when you're ready. I'm just going to share my screen. And welcome, Bob, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. First, thank you for the opportunity to work with you folks in developing a set of enrollment projections for the school. I spent 6 years on my local school board a long time ago, and as president, and building facility use is hugely important. So I understand it from that aspect also, but from a demographic aspect, my career was with New York State as chief demographer for 20 years of the last part of my career, but I've spent 30, almost 40 years dealing with demographic data, census information, trained demographer. I can raise my hand and say I am actually a demographer by training. And more recently, I retired from New York State in 2010 and started RLS Demographics to continue data analysis. One of my specialty areas has always been in state and county projection work, demographic analysis for community development. I was in the Department of Economic Development, and so we were always heavily involved with data for business attraction efforts within New York. More recently, actually it's 5-6 years now, that I've been involved with doing enrollment projections and a link between the demographic projections that has been most of my career and the enrollment projections. So what I want to do in the next, hopefully I'll keep this to 10 or 15 minutes, is walk you through the process that I use for doing demographic and enrollment projections. So Greg, if you can go to the next slide. So there are basically 3 processes or 3 modules to my approach to doing these forecasts. The first is called components of change. Population changes in any of our communities only by 3 methods. People are born into the community, people die and leave the community, or people migrate in and out. And so the components of change is a historical analysis of what those processes have been for a given community. So for Southborough, I'm looking at census population, decennial census, as well as population estimates on an annual basis. Vital statistics data for births by age of mother and deaths by age. Births and deaths, they are used for defining fertility rates and mortality rates. And from that analysis, I generate a number of rates of change. Those rates, as I mentioned, survival rates to predict survival. I'm going to say that I believe most all of us are familiar with or have heard the term of life expectancy. And that's what our estimates of life expectancy come from, analysis of the mortality data. And the fertility patterns, I'll get into this in more detail. And total fertility rate, measure the level of fertility and the number of births that have happened and are going to happen. And the same thing with migration. How does the population move in and out of our communities? So all of that provides a base of benchmark data based on actual reported vital statistics and historical analysis. That feeds into the population projections. So my projections model is based on census data. That's our best, most accurate measure, benchmark of population characteristics. And the projections are done in 5-year age categories and in 5-year periods of time. So in this case, we start, since the 2020 census data is just coming out, we're still basing this on the 2010 census and updating, but the survival rates and fertility rates and migration rates from the components of change all drive the projections model. And the outputs from that is the population forecast for 30 years. And in this case, it takes me out to the year 2040. And the two most important pieces that come out of that effort is the age and sex detail, because one of the hugely important factors in looking at future births and fertility is the number of women of childbearing age. Again, I'll get into more detail about that. But the model also projects the number of births based on the number of women of childbearing age and the fertility rates that are specified. And it's that birth number that is the real link between the demographic side of the model and the enrollment projections model. The enrollment model uses a standard grade progression ratio. The inputs into that are historical enrollment by grade level. And let's see, I think the data you provided, Greg, goes back to year 2010. We've got at least a 10-year history of enrollment by grade. And I've got the birth data, historical birth data, as well as the projected births. And out of that comes the grade progression ratios, which I'll explain in more detail, but the projected enrollment by grade as students move through their educational experience. So Greg, if we move to the next one. So one of the key pieces of this is the fertility analysis and numbers of births. So this first graphic on the left at the top, age-specific fertility rates. This is why I need age, population of women by age and births by age of mother. And the two important things to look at are the red line, which is based on the 2010 data, historical analysis, and the blue line, which is the most recent data based on census estimates and the current data from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And one of the things that you see is that the more current data is lower infertility rate in just about every age. There are very few teenage and young 20s births, but it rises pretty rapidly. But even at the peak of 30 to 34, and this is where we see the delay of marriage and childbearing, that peak has dropped from 2010 pretty significantly. And you can see the increase at the ages 35 to 39. And again, that's illustrative of the delay in childbearing, of marriage and childbearing. And then it tapers off pretty quickly to very few births occurring to women in their 40s. So it's that change that is important to recognize, and this is not unique to Southborough in any manner. It's a national trend, and this delay of marriage and childbearing has been going on for a couple of decades. And on the right, you see the projected number of births. So the blue line is the actual reported data from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and the kind of orange rust color data is the projection based on the demographic projections model. This table in the middle, total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is an average number of children per woman. The 2010 to 15 rate, 2.1, this is actual Southborough data, and 2.1 is what we call the replacement level of fertility. In other words, a woman has to have more than 2 children to replace herself, a partner, and account for women who have no children. And the projection of the total fertility rate shows a decline in the second period, 2015 to 2020. That's reflective of the national trend of declining fertility. And also, while we don't have total reported data yet, there's going to be an impact of COVID, the pandemic, on fertility rates, as well as you'll see in migration. And then my projection, my assumption about the future of fertility is that it will increase back to that replacement level, because Southborough is a suburban residential community, and there's not a lot to indicate that there will be major changes in that level. And the way this interacts, this age pattern that you see in that graphic interacts with the total fertility rate, because the age pattern is based on the number of women, and the total fertility rate can be used to increase the number of births or decrease the number of births. Okay, Greg, next slide. So a similar process occurs with migration analysis, and the migration analysis is important because of trying to get a handle on how the number of women of childbearing age is going to change in the future. Mortality affects this population, but to a really small extent, because survival rates in those age categories are really pretty high. And obviously nobody gets born into that age category. So the primary factor of change here is the cohort structure of the population by age and the migration rates. And migration is handled in a similar manner to fertility. There's an age pattern of migration, which you see in the upper left graphic. And what this shows is, and the easiest thing to illustrate here, is the connection between migration of births and young under 5 population with the 30 and 30-year-olds, late 20s, early 40s, high in migration to Southborough. But shortly after that, the intervening period of the teenage years, you see significant outmigration, and that's a variety of things. Certainly in the 15 to 19, you have some that's correlated to college age population moving out, some that is correlated to the lower migration rates in the 40 and on up population. In the older population, there's a lot of variability due to retirement, older population return migration for services. Massachusetts, like New York, is a prime candidate for return migration because of family locations and services. The most important piece here, though, is that middle part of the graphic in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, because that's the link to the women of childbearing age, which you see is forecast to increase, not to a great extent, but there will be an increase in women of childbearing age. The migration rates, the table in the middle, you see the 2010 to 15 and 2015 to 20 is based on historical data, the census data and census estimates, as well as the 2020 census. We don't have a lot of data from 2020, but enough to help control that. There's been a decline during that period of migration. Part of that is the latter years, 19 and 20, where COVID is an impact, but in general, there's been a slowing of migration. But my assumption, my projection is that Southborough's migration rate will increase slightly, not to the height of the 2010 to 15 period, but will stay at a point roughly midway between the two historical periods. Okay, Greg, next slide. So some of the summary from the projection model. I'm projecting that the Southborough population will increase. The 2020 figure here, 458, is the actual reported 2020 census results. So that came out in a good timing to be able to incorporate into the model and projections, and that Southborough will increase about almost 10% to 2030, and women are projected to increase about 8%. Women of childbearing age are projected to increase by almost 9%. And you can see the trend in 5-year period births is expected to increase to 2030 by about almost 37%. After that time, I'm looking that there will be a decline in number of births. We know that our baby boom generation is aging, certainly has aged well out of the fertility ages, but the millennial generation, which is really quite large, and in fact, a larger number of births than the original baby boomers, by 2035 and 2040, they will be aging out of the fertility ages, and I'm looking at a decline in the number of births. That decline is not affecting our projections for fall of 2030 in enrollment. So we can go to the next slide, Greg. Now this looks a little messy, so bear with me as I try and simplify what's going on in this table. Grade progression ratio is a standard methodology for doing school enrollment projections. And what it does is look at the advancement of students by grade level. So you can see in the middle here, in the green shaded areas. And this is actual enrollment. So grade 1, you had 120 students. In fall of 2018, that number went up to 124. So there was a little bit of an increase in enrollment. And if you go down to the progression ratio part of the table, Greg, you see that there's a ratio of a little bit higher than 1 of 1.033. That number, that progression ratio, is what's used to drive changes in enrollment by grade throughout the projection model, with a twist that I'll explain in a minute. Reason the births are so important in this is because births in 5 years generally will be enrolled in kindergarten. In 6 years, they will be enrolled in first grade. And so we need to keep track of births, and we need to have a progression ratio of births into the school system as well. So if we go back a little bit, the blue area. So in 2011, Southborough had 76 births, and they would become kindergartners 5 years later in fall of 2016. And there were 119 of them. Now, that's a lot more enrollment than the births would indicate. But oftentimes, I know in our district in New York, children weren't required to go to kindergarten. And so some folks homeschool. There are a variety of reasons why that number is much higher. But again, it creates a ratio of births to kindergarten enrollment, in this case, 1.566. So all of the other numbers in this grade progression ratio are defined in the same manner. Simple ratio of a base population and how it ages into the later grades and school years. Now, the twist to this is there can be an awful lot of year-to-year variability. And a standard approach to using these grade progression ratios is to use a 3-year average to smooth out some of that variation. And so that's what you see in the kind of yellow gold bar in the grade progression ratio. The average of those 3 years for birth to kindergarten averages to 1.338. Grade 2 to 3, that averages to a little bit lower enrollment, 0.996. Those numbers then become key in the projection process. So we're now looking at the right side of this table and how we move students through in a projection model. So in fall of 2023, the kind of brownish rust color boxes, we have 84 births, actual births reported for Southborough in 2018. They become kindergartners in fall of 2023. That 84 is increased by the progression ratio of 1.338. Similarly, another example would be students who are in grade 2 moving to grade 3. So grade 2 students, fall of 2024 are 112. The progression ratio is almost 1, which is why the projection for fall of 25 is no change. It's a fraction of a student and no change. But that's the process by which the grade progression ratio is applied to current enrollment and future projected births. If we go to the next slide, Greg, this is the result. So the result of that process all the way out to fall enrollment of 2030. The blue line here shows the actual enrollment reported for Southborough, and the rust-colored line shows the projected numbers, as well as the table to the right. So I'm looking at, by fall of 2030, 1,266 enrolled students, which is actually just about up to the district's enrollment then in the beginning in fall of 2015. So the district has seen an actual decline of about 110, 111 in actual enrollment to date, fall of 2021. But then we're going to look at an increase, gradual each year, but a continual increase through the projection period, and picking up somewhat in the later part of the projection period, fall of 2027 through fall of 30, a little bit more rapid increase at that point. And I think that's hopefully a understandable explanation of the process that I went through and the results of the projection model. So I'm happy to entertain questions.
Bob, the other day, when we took a look at the population growth and the percentages of men and women, I had wondered why the percentage of women to total population in Southborough seemed to get lower. Well, at least it did get lower on those statistics. And I know that you didn't necessarily have an answer to that. Have you had a chance to determine if there is a logical answer to that, or not?
I did, Roger, and I should have included that in one of these tables because of your question. But it really is pretty consistent. in Southborough. The example that we were looking at the other day was for another Massachusetts community. And I'm typing here and calculating as I'm talking. So in Southborough, women were about 50.5% of the population in 2010. And my projection in 2040 puts that at 49.3%. So they're really
Pretty close. Okay.
hovers right around that 50% point. So I'd have to do a little bit more investigation of the other community and see if I could come up with a better explanation. But for Southborough, it looks pretty consistent.
All right. Well, let's see. There are several hands. Keturah, Martin.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. I had read the report, but it was very helpful to see it all sort of consolidated in some sort of summary information. And I have to say, the grade progression ratio, I'm going to start with a comment, that is, that clarifies for me personally anyway so much, because just observation would tell someone that, you know, the fertility rate and the births in the town aren't the only kids who end up going to school in the school system. And so the ratio, looking at historically how those two numbers relate to each other, the births and the enrollment, and then applying that to the future, that makes so much sense to me. And I appreciate your explanation of that. That was very helpful. One question that I have is, well, it's maybe two parts. How was a potential development in the town accounted for in this analysis? And also, if it wasn't, I guess what I'm thinking about is, and this is a question that I've always had in my head as we're going through this process, is I look at all the towns around us, and in many of them, there's been a massive amount of development that might happen, say, in just a few years. And I know we can talk about whether there's space in the town for that or not. Assuming that there could be some space, is that something that, I mean, it's so, you know, we don't know if that's going to happen. And so how could we take that into account? But I'm just sort of wondering what your views are on that potential, you know, eventuality if it were to happen in Southborough, and how we should think about that possibility in the context of this.
Sure. No, good question. And it ties back to your first comment about the grade progression ratio. First, there is no explicit attempt to factor in housing development in this set of projections. Having said that, that's part of what the grade progression ratio actually does, because you're absolutely correct. Perception of the other things that are going on is partially why this is such an accepted methodology, because if a ratio is above 1 for the later grades, births aren't impacting that. Something else must be going on. So there's a movement of students, typically between public and private schooling, between homeschooling and public or private schooling. Migration impacts that, and housing development impacts that. So theoretically, if you're looking at a ratio of over 1, part of that over 1 could be new housing that attracted families that migrated in. And the method, that's one of the aspects of the method that is highly desirable, because it captures a lot of potential change. Now, a ratio of under 1 kind of works in the opposite direction. Maybe out migration, maybe students moving from public to private, or other changes in enrollment. Maybe there has been housing changes that have demolished older housing and hasn't been replaced. So it works in both ways, but it captures lots of different factors that are going on in a community. Now, how you could incorporate that in the future would be to have some good data. And I looked at building permit data from the Census Bureau, but it's historical and it doesn't really show me anything about expected development. But if you were looking at Southborough as an area that had vacant developable land, you're certainly close enough to Boston that it would be reasonable that you would, want to accommodate or provide for expansion. And the key point of analysis would be how much larger is that future housing development than what has occurred in the past? Because what's occurred in the past is kind of already captured in the grade progression ratio. So we'd want to know what's the excess, how much larger is future development than what was occurring in the past, and then factor that in.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, Jason, I'm just going down sequentially. I noticed that you've got hand raised also.
I do. I wanted to also first thank Bob and echo Katara's comments. That grade progression ratio, I thought, is critically important. If we can get any of that extrapolated in our documentation, I think would be very helpful. Bob, my question is very specific, and if you need some time to answer it or come back at a later point, but I focused on what we know is our current enrollment this year. And I looked at the kindergarten class of 117 students, and I see it growing to 148 next year. But then I go back to the percentage that you had on one of the slides that it should be a 1.05 factor for 3 years. Now, I didn't have the 1.05 before you made the presentation, but I had flagged this before. I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to have a 31 student enrollment increase to next year. And if there's a fact that someone knows, I'm happy to hear it. And I base that purely not based on data or statistics like you do, but I look back here and we know what obviously the world went through last year. And we've heard in many times with our meetings with Greg, how certain parents didn't send their kids to kindergarten or homeschooled or went to private school last year because of just the conditions that we all had to live through. So do you have an explanation for why there's that 31 student jump? And then part B of that is if you follow that all the way through to grade 8, that initial class that starts at about 117 becomes 179 students by the time they leave Trotter. Just looking to kind of tie that all together.
All right. First, let me be clear. I thought I heard you say the 31 increase would be in the kindergarten population, but the 31 increase is students moving from kindergarten into first grade.
That's correct. That's what I was referring to, yeah.
Okay. Certainly that's based on the historical grade progression ratio. And I guess I'd want to maybe have a conversation with you at another time to get into more detail. But the increase beyond that would certainly be reflective of the historical changes in Southborough, which I'm going to assume at this point is due primarily to migration of families coming in and adding to that student enrollment over the entire time period. Because it is simply a mathematical model at that point, because you have actual students and you're moving them through the grade system based on that historical data. So,
but the 3-year average in the 3-year average in the slide said 1.05, right? So just at a macro perspective, I should be thinking about it, taking the 117 and multiplying it by 1.05. Is that correct? Or am I misunderstanding how the grade progression ratio works?
I think there's a little different factor occurring in the kindergarten to grade 1, because that certainly would not be 1.05. The grade 1 to grade 2 and so on is reflective of the 1.05.
Okay, so I'll just leave with this.
I think what you're seeing historically is that there are students who did not go to kindergarten who are entering in first grade. So you're seeing a larger jump and a higher grade progression ratio because of that.
Okay. So I'd appreciate some follow-up on that, because when I looked for every year beyond FY21, when I take grade K and multiply it by 1.05, that 3-year average you had from K to 1, it works. And it's just really, you just kind of look at the numbers. There's no year greater than 10 for every year beyond today. But for some reason, we're saying there's some abnormality or something in the
Okay.
data that's explaining that something's going to happen next year. So if you want to follow up on that, I realize it's a very detailed question,
Okay.
but
No,
that's where the
I see.
question came from.
Yeah, that clarifies it. So I'm highlighting my spreadsheet here to focus on that. So I will follow up with you
Thank
after.
you.
Thanks, Jason. Kim? You're muted.
There we go.
There you go.
So my question's kind of a follow-up of Kachora's question. And I really don't know who I'm asking. I'm wondering if this kind of work has been done for any of the potential big development projects that are sort of not here yet, but maybe be here, you know?
In terms of housing development,
Yes. So I don't know if it's really a question for you. I'm wondering if, I don't know, Roger or Jason or Greg might have sort of like the history. Like, do we know like how these numbers might be impacted by anything down the road that's sort of already in the pipeline?
Well, I'll make a quick comment, and then I'm sure someone will be able to jump in and answer the question. And whether it's, we actually had this conversation. We had a kind of a pre-meeting, a few of us with Bob earlier in the week, and that specific question came up. For example, for example, there might be one development. I think there's some litigation going around. We don't know whether that's going to be affecting the community or not. I mean, the basic answer was that if there aren't items that are actually, what was the term you used, Bob?
in the pipeline,
Yeah, well, it was in the pipeline.
Permitted.
permitted.
Fine, permitted. And if you were permitted with no problems, yeah, there could be some out there, but they wouldn't be in this projection because that's speculative. So that's my stab at it. But Greg or Bob or even Jason, do you have a comment?
When we received NASDAQ's projections, we asked the same question, and they used the same methodology in terms of they did not include any projected large projects that could impact school enrollment in the future. So the same methodology was applied that Bob used in his methodology with our prior NASDAQ projections that we did this past year, but in the prior years as well.
It's a pretty standard thing to not incorporate, I'll say, thought of development in state and local projection world, that if there are projects that are permitted, that's an important indicator. But getting a building permit doesn't necessarily mean you build, just means you have the opportunity to build. So unless there is some hard data, it's typical to not include those type of changes in a model such as this, whether it's the enrollment projections or general demographic projections. When you have hard data, when you know that something is going to happen, then it's important to take that into account. But otherwise, standard process is, and keep it on the drawing board. When it becomes a reality, then you take account of it. Now, which isn't to say that you could not develop scenarios, what if type of scenarios. But when it comes down to needing some hard data, those what if scenarios are just that.
Before, go ahead. Well, I was going to comment on your comment, Kim, but go ahead. Did you wanted to
Well,
add to it?
I guess I'm sort of asking, and maybe that is the answer, that was there any what if of this kind of work done in the lead up to, for instance, the project that's in litigation now?
I think the answer is not in this projection. Now, let me just try to finish the subject a little bit, because I noticed Kamali's up next. So if you and Keturah have the same concern that I might have, and maybe others, one of the challenges, if we're trying to project what we're supposed to do for building classrooms and not wanting to miss and have not enough space to house students at some point in time in the future in a project that's going to take a while, right? This is not something that's going to happen, in a year. When we're in I guess I'm going to call it a community that is not as highly developed from a housing standpoint as some other communities, not being able to use these what ifs, but we really don't know what or the if is, puts us more at risk, right? Because in a community that potentially could have a number of large projects that aren't thought of right now, there's just more risk at the end, I think, than if you're in a community that is relatively 100% built out. How many more houses could you have in some communities versus what could happen to us? I'm not sure what the answer is. Myself, there are people smarter about this type of thing than I am, that's for sure. Bob, I don't know if you have a comment to that, or I'll be happy to move on to other questions.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add, but be clear that this does not incorporate those developments, but the grade progression ratio, if those developments aren't any larger than what historically has happened in the town, then you're not gonna add a whole lot to the projections, because the grade progression ratio kind of is already capturing some of that historical development change.
Okay, so you're saying if the slope of, if there's development yet to do, but if the slope of the future development doesn't get much steeper than what we've seen that goes into some of the historical data, we're probably not going to miss by very much. That's what you're suggesting.
That's correct. If historically the town had 50 new units coming online and those 50 units were occupied, then the students in those 50 units would have been captured in the historical grade progression ratio. If the future development is that same 50 units, then you're not really impacting things. But if you then put in a development of 100 units, then you have an impact that's beyond the historical impact.
Yeah, I think that's what we might be concerned about. I'm sorry. So Kamala, you've had your hand up for a while. Sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, where is he? I just wanted to ask whether or not we had the information back prior to 2015. On the last slide, I think it went from 2015 to either 2030 or 2040. And it showed this kind of sine wave action where 2015 we were up, then we went through a long period, several years of down. And you're projecting that we come back to where we started in 2015, that 2000 number, 2600 number. I just want to know if that looks like it's a repeat of maybe a span of 15 to 20 years earlier as well.
I don't have that long a historical set of data. I could certainly, if Greg, if you could provide that to me, I could certainly comment better on that. Obviously, the projection kind of smooths out. It's kind of inherent in projections to not incorporate, year to year kind of variability, because that kind of, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's so you simplify the assumption and it smooths out all of that variation. So if, Greg, if you could get me a longer history of enrollment, then I'd be better able to comment on that.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, Robert, all that does for me and the team is just allow us to see that, even for the long analysis that you've already done, when we see like, oh, okay, this is actually repeating, but maybe there's an incremental, increase.
Mhm.
It just adds a little bit more of showing me that the history is repeating itself.
Yeah, I'll anticipate that what you're going to see in a longer history is a continued decline in enrollment, because once you're looking at that, 15, 20-year history, you're looking at a long period of decline in births in nationwide. So again,
Right.
Southborough isn't so unusual in that sense. So that's what I'd anticipate. And if that's not what's happening, something else is going on in Southborough.
Okay. All
Okay.
right, thank you.
Hi, Kathy. Good evening to you.
Hi, Roger.
Nice.
So to go back to the previous discussion, Bob, we do have an unusual project on the table in Southborough. It's not 50 units, it's over 300 units. That's what everyone's referring to tonight. The developer is determined to go through with it. It would add 10% to the population of Southborough, most likely. His estimate is going to add 100 students in the school system all the way through, not just K through 8, K through 12. So it could be significant. I think when we get to the next part of our discussion, you're going to see, I think we've got to put a cushion into these numbers when we decide what to do to at least account for it. And we'll probably going to know fairly soon where it's going. It's winding its way through. The court case is done. They're waiting for the decision. So we'll know, but it is not a 50-unit thing that would be part of the natural migration and increase. It is a unusual increase that we're looking at.
And I just pulled the number 50 out of the air. Southborough's historical development may or may not be anywhere close to that, but an addition of 300 units would certainly be an important difference. And if the developer is already talking about that, it impacts the number of births, and it impacts just general family development and the students that would be coming into the district as a result of that new development. Assuming that it's the type of development becomes important, because if those are single bedroom apartments, then you're not talking about student generation. If you're looking at single family homes, 2, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom homes, then you're talking about different student generation. Student generation is the other factor that becomes important whenever you're talking about the development of the housing development impacts. So that type of development, you're going to have more students coming out of larger single family homes than you will have coming out of 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. So the type of development is critical.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions for Bob? Well, my thanks too, Bob. Excellent report of both the other day and tonight. So thanks very much. Greg, do you have anything to summarize before you take over the next agenda item?
Yeah, I just want to comment that, one of the things Bob has committed to us is, helping us kind of work through various scenarios, those what ifs, and really looking at, what if a variable changes, what is the impact in terms of the overall enrollment of our schools? So Jason, to your earlier comment around, if something doesn't make sense, Bob is still on the books and still working with us to think about the different analyses that we can do to make sure we get this right.
And that, looking at different scenarios is particularly in your case where it's important to do. What I did learn in doing some preliminary work in that area is that it's really the fertility component that has a much more substantial impact on potential scenarios than the migration component. But again, that discounts what we were just talking about in terms of the impact of housing. If you're talking about that kind of large housing development, that would be a very significant change in migration. And I kind of jokingly relayed the other day that in my tenure on the school board in our local district, building, it's a small rural district, and building support for additional building and expense was not that high. And we found ourselves in a situation of needing to have mobile trailers brought in to accommodate class sizes. So I understand from your perspective also how important it is to get as close a handle on what you think is going to happen in the future. So good luck. I know having sat close to your seats that it's a challenge.
All right. Well, thank you again. I think the next item up is the space needs study report. Back to you,
Sure.
Greg.
Sure. So, the school committee in winter of 2021 charged the district with looking at grade level configuration and doing a close analysis around different scenarios. So we, as a leadership team, have spent a lot of time thinking about the different grade level configurations and scenarios with the current facilities that we have. And part of our work is really using Bob's data in his enrollment projections. But I just want to acknowledge that the examination of facilities, programming and capital investments require a community partnership, parents, students, educators, citizens, and the town of Southborough key stakeholders in vetting recommendations and determining next steps. And the information that I'm presenting this evening is really intended to serve as a catalyst for the district and the school committee to engage all stakeholders in future decisions and capital improvements to school facilities. And I just also want to acknowledge that the district is part of a larger ecosystem of the town, and school-based projects cannot be viewed in isolation and need to be placed in the context of the town's master plan. So I just wanted to begin with that, and I'm going to share my screen. And can everyone see my screen? All right. So this evening I'll be presenting a space needs analysis. And again, much of the presentation is supported by a detailed report, which provides much more in-depth data using Bob's grade progression ratio data, as well as different scenarios and what the school population would look like based on the data in the demographic report we heard about tonight. So the first thing I just want to share is that, I think when we look at our facilities, we really look at our role as a district and what our statement of mission and vision are. And the mission is quite simple: educate, inspire, and challenge all students, and really thinking about what type of students we want to graduate Algonquin Regional High School. And really it's to make sure that students are collaborators, critical creative thinkers, communicators, students who are socially and civically engaged, growth-oriented, and healthy and balanced.
Greg, do you want to be in present mode so it's a little bigger?
Can you, I actually
I
don't.
mean, okay, it's
Okay.
fine.
Can people, I can make it a little bigger.
It's fine. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So in our strategic plan, Vision 2026, we have 5 strategic objectives: empowering learners, equity of opportunity, healthy and balanced learners, educator learning and leadership, and finance and operations to support teaching and learning. And really under the 5th strategic objective, we have some action steps around engaging the school community in open dialogue about the quality of school facilities that will support the next generation of Southborough students. And really the work that we've been doing with the school research committee has been centered around this. You know, what will the next generation of students need in terms of school facilities? And really we set out some actions to partner with the town of Southborough on long-term capital and master planning, complete a needs assessment of each school facility, research potential partnerships with the Massachusetts School Building Authority and funding opportunities, and then develop and submit a statement of interest and education plan for NARI to MSBA. We're all identified action steps in our strategic plan. So the goals of our the presentation and evaluation was really to evaluate enrollment trends and projections and look to identify opportunities to effectively maximize school facilities and resources to really improve educational experiences for our students, to work in partnership with the town of Southborough's capital planning committee, school research subcommittee. And then again, the final goal was to present an analysis to the Southborough School Committee. And this is kind of a culminating presentation this evening. So in terms of the process, we partnered with the town of Southborough's capital planning school research committee, and I can't say that 10 times fast. So we updated our district capital plan, thinking about what are those capital investments that are going to be required of our school facilities over the next 6 to 8 years. And then we commissioned enrollment projection studies. We commissioned a study with NESDEC. And then this evening you received the information from our RLS demography. We also in process commissioned NARI school facilities conditions assessment because our concern with our overall facilities is NARI school in terms of its age and the investments that need to be made in the future years. As part of the process, we conducted a literature review of school configuration research, and then we analyzed scenarios based on enrollment projections using an RLS demography report. Continuing with the process, we convened a leadership team, which included special education director, principals, key central office leadership team, and looked at potential scenarios and made sure we had much input and feedback around what those scenarios could look like. And then we identified the criteria to evaluate each scenario. And then we utilized the enrollment projections, again, conducted by RLS. And we made some assumptions in our scenarios. The first assumption is that we're using the 2030 projections. We're assuming a 10% increase in total fertility rate and crude migration rate. And this is some of the flexibility that we had conversations with Bob around, what if scenario. And this was one methodology to look at 10% increase in total fertility and crude migration in the 2030 year to really provide some flexibility. So that is the ceiling that we're working with. And we're looking at rate over baseline for 2030 projections. So we used 2020, which was 1,135. And then in terms of our assumptions, we use preschool enrollment projection of N60, 60 preschoolers with no change in preschool requirements from the state. So in terms of our review of the research, one of the things which is probably not too surprising to most folks is that most communities use the spaces they have and let their spaces drive grade level configurations. So it's not always by programmatic design. It's based on what facilities a town or city might have, and they use those accordingly. So really the conversation that we're having this evening is really if we could design grade level configurations by programmatic design, what would those potential scenarios look like? Grade level configuration significantly impacts whether resources are being used efficiently, time, people, materials, and instructional material resources. So again, if you think about our particular context in Southborough, where there is a cadre of resources in each of our school buildings, having smaller or larger grade level configurations in one building allows for more opportunities for those resources to be maximized. Reducing the number of transitions between schools in a K-5 experience does not impact student performance and a student's or family's sense of community. So again, this is a review of the literature. However, I think if you ask many families in Southborough, I think the 2 years in a school and then moving on can have an impact, but the research does state that it doesn't impact student performance and a student family sense of community. How educators are logically grouped across buildings impacts the opportunities for teachers to collaborate. Again, the example in our context is for our 3rd grade teachers to work with our 4th and 5th grade teachers. Their different schedules, just a little bit more work in terms of getting folks together to collaborate and work. Not impossible, but just not as easy as if folks were in the same facility or building. And then researchers generally find that a higher number of school transitions may result in decreased student achievement and could affect instructional continuity and communication across grades. So if you think of the time and energy our educators and principals spend preparing students for the next grade level or for the next transition of schools, it does take time to do that. And because we are in 2-year cycles, there are many transitions and much time is devoted to making sure that we transition students well from school to school and grade level to grade level.
Greg, if I could just ask you a question about questions.
Sure.
Would you like to take any school committee questions that might come up during the presentation, or would you like to complete and then ask for questions at that point in time? What is your preference?
I think I'd like to present the information,
Roger,
and then we
you.
can go back and answer any questions. And so the next slide really speaks about evaluated enrollment projections. And this was the enrollment projection we commissioned with NASDAQ. And compared to RLS Demography's projections, its projection was a 3.8% enrollment decrease by 2030. So I think just in terms of a source of comparison, I will share that I've had conversations with both NASDAQ and RLS in terms of methodology. I have a much better understanding of the methodology that RLS Demography used to calculate its numbers than I do with NASDAQ. And I also did share the NASDAQ report with Bob just to get his expertise in terms of, can you enlighten me on anything I'm not understanding in terms of methodology? And he was very helpful in terms of understanding NASDAQ's report. The next slide is really the enrollment projections we use for the various scenarios. And this is the detailed table in Bob's report that he provided the district that really talks about, the grade level, grade progression ratio and the impact it has on the number of students in each particular grade across the number of years. And RLS projects 11.54% increase in enrollment by 2030 compared to from 2020 as a baseline. So one of the discussions that the team had around, how do we make sure that we don't under project or we don't over project enrollment. We need to make sure that our numbers are accurate in terms of thinking about scenarios. So having a conversation with Bob around looking at various scenarios and different methodology. What we assumed in our projection was from the projection Bob provided, the 11.54%, and using the total fertility rate and crude migration rate, we used a 10% increase to those two factors. And those are the numbers that we use as our assumptions for each of the scenarios that I'll be presenting this evening. So we did identify criteria to evaluate the various scenarios. So again, we had a leadership team to review scenarios and provide input and feedback. We identified criteria to evaluate each scenario. And again, we used the enrollment projections provided by RLS, and we used 2030 projections and assumed 10% increase in total fertility rate and crude migration rate. And then we did use NASDAQ's 2030 preschool enrollment projections and assumptions. So the criteria that we established to evaluate each of the scenarios were meet occupancy rate of each of the current facilities, septic capacity, meets programmatic space requirements, meaning it does not require us to condense programming that we currently have, or, for example, put art on a cart, or no longer have specialized programming, for example, for special education. And if you think of, for example, Trotter has the NEC program. It also has a CASTLE program, very important programs in our school continuum. And the projections or the assumptions that we made that there were no changes to spacing requirements. Another criteria was that the scenario maximizes teacher collaboration and maximizes resources. And lastly, the last criterion is minimizes student transitions. So again, minimize the number of transitions students have to make from school to school across their schooling experience in Southborough. So as a result, we identified several scenarios to evaluate. In particular, there were 4 scenarios. So the first scenario that we examined was keep current configuration. So keep the current grade spans pre-K through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 through 8. The second scenario is consolidating to 3 schools. Decommissioning Woodward, so looking at pre-K through 2, grades 3 through 5, and grades 6 through 8. The third scenario is really looking at consolidating to 3 schools, decommissioning Neary, so looking at pre-K through 2, again 3 through 5, and 6 through 8. And lastly, consolidating to 3 schools again, decommissioning Neary, but then looking at keeping Finn pre-K through 1, and having a 2 through 4 grade configuration, and then a 5 through 8 grade configuration. So then in the report, we look at all the data, we examine the data, and then we made some analyses based on each of the schools and whether we thought that the grade configuration would meet all of the criteria. It was just basically, would it meet it yes or no? So when we look at scenario 1, keep current grade configuration, it does meet occupancy permit across our 4 schools, septic capacity. It does meet programmatic requirements. But from our perspective, it doesn't necessarily in our elementary schools maximize collaboration, maximize resources, nor does it minimize student transitions. So you can see our analysis here in terms of keeping the current configuration that exists. The next scenario, scenario 2, was really looking to consolidate to 3 schools, pre-K2, 3 through 5 and 6 through 8, and decommissioning Woodward. So we would move 2nd grade to Finn and 3rd grade to Neary. And again, we applied the same criteria and analysis. In terms of the enrollment data we used, it would not meet occupancy permit at Finn, nor septic capacity. And also it would have an impact on our programs. For example, it would require us to use space very differently, potentially have art on a cart as an example, or not allow us to provide some specialized programming in terms of student support services. At Neary School, it did meet occupancy permit, it did not meet septic capacity, and again, did not meet programmatic space requirements. So we would need to, have our cart as an example again, and have compromised programming. This also assumes that central office is relocated to another location. So it's using all the available space at Neary in terms of classroom. We did feel that it maximized collaboration, resources, and again, it removed one student transition, so it did minimize student transitions. And then Trotter School, there would be no change. So again, it met all the criteria because there was no change. In terms of scenario 3, was really looking to consolidate to 3 schools again, but this time looking to decommission Neary School. So again, pre-K through 2, so moving grade 2 from Woodward to Finn, and grades 3 through 5. So we would move grades 4 and 5 to Woodward. So Mary E. Finn, again, the same, would not meet the occupancy permit, did meet the septic capacity. We did not, from our analysis, it did not meet programmatic space requirements, but did meet the last 3 criteria in terms of collaboration, maximize, as well as resources, and minimize student transitions. In terms of Woodward becoming 3 through 5, it did not meet the occupancy permit. It did meet the septic capacity, but did not meet the programmatic space requirements, and it met the last 3 criteria. And then again, no change for Trotter in terms of it being a 6 through 8 grade span. And then the last scenario that we evaluated was really consolidate to 3 schools, leave pre-K 1, leave Finn School as is, early childhood center, have a grades 2 through 4 building, which would be Woodward, decommission Neary, and then have a 5 through 8 scenario. And again, applying the same criteria, Finn we'd be able to meet all of the criteria set forth in this analysis. At Woodward, we would not meet the occupancy permit. We would meet this septic capacity, but we would not meet the programmatic space requirements. But we would maximize resources and collaboration and minimize transitions. And then in terms of Trotter becoming a 5 through 8, it would meet all the criteria in terms of occupancy permit, septic capacity, meeting programmatic space requirements, collaboration, maximizing resources, and minimizing transitions. So those were the 4 scenarios that we evaluated. And I'll just kind of summarize the position. So we continue to evaluate different scenarios, but the district's position is that based on our analysis and the data that we use from RLS demography, it's not feasible to consolidate due to the current spacing requirements required to maintain class size and to continue to offer the full complement of programming to students. Again, how do we look at making sure that we have the right capacity when we look out at 10 years to 2030 for enrollment capacity? And again, the methodology that we use was 10% increase in total fertility rate and crude migration rate. There's probably some debate around whether that's too high of a ceiling to use, but I think that's where Bob can really help us hone in on some of these analyses and scenarios. And the district needs to plan for the probability that within the next 10 years, all schools in the Commonwealth will be required to offer universal preschool. So what if scenario, what if that were to take place? That would require us to increase our preschool programming. I think we would see an increase in enrollment, and again, would need more spaces. So in terms of our next steps, the district's recommendation is to investigate a building project that would consolidate schools, whether that is in addition to looking at Neary School, looking at Woodward. There are various scenarios that would need to be examined. We did submit a statement of interest to MSBA for Neary School, and I will share that this past week, the MSBA senior study team did come out to interview the school and the school committee to get a better sense of the scope of the project and some of its planning behind the scenes that was taking place. And then yesterday, the senior team took a tour of Neary School to look at the actual facility. We are one of 11 statement of interest that the MSBA is evaluating, and we should have some indication early in December around whether we're going to make it to the next phase of determining if we're going to be invited in. We could hear by the end of December or potentially in March, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone attended that meeting, from MSBA, whether or not we're invited into the eligibility phase of the core building project. So that is underway, and we're in a waiting game. I think we'll continue to partner with the town's capital planning committee and the school research committee to kind of dive into these scenarios a little bit more deeply. We're partnering with the Southborough Select Board and town's master plan, and partnering with MSBA. We're evaluating and updating the district's capital plan. So what are the larger investments that need to be made in our facilities, whether it's windows, boiler units, roofs, what are those investments that are going to be required? Our next step is to seek community input and feedback on various scenarios, and then continue to look for opportunities to, again, maximize people, materials, and instructional resources. Look for opportunities to maximize collaboration with faculty and staff. We have amazing faculty and staff. Look for opportunities to minimize student transitions. And we think minimizing transitions will help the district increase the continuity and coherence of the overall program. So with that said, that is the presentation, and I'd be happy to open it up to any questions or comments.
Kamali, Kamali, I see your hand up first.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg, for the overview. When I reviewed the deck earlier, one of the questions that came up was that we talk about possibility of universal pre-K within maybe 10 years. And I wanted to know if option one still works. So does everything that's green in option one still work if we increase universal pre-K?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the next question I have is in the next phase of review and analysis, I think we need to pull in that 10-year estimate to maybe being sooner. Because even it's 2021 right now, and we're already talking about universal pre-K in Massachusetts. It may even be just getting discussed this week. That's the only thing I want to offer, that when we're doing that review, that we pull in that timeline to sooner than that.
Thank you, Kamali.
Hey, Kathy,
Yes, sir.
I see your hand up there.
Greg, can you share your screen again and go back to the report and go back to the slide that shows the impact of putting the cushion in, increasing the migration rate and the fertility rate?
Yes, I'll try not to make you seasick while I do this. Yes.
Okay, so now put your cursor on the top blue line, the first top blue line. So I understand. So I see the numbers that Bob came up with, right? The 2030. No, I can't see it. The 1266. See the 1266? I think I can point and I can't, right?
Right
So
here.
yeah. So now go back to the next one. Okay, so you see the 1266 again in that top line, like 3 over, go to the left, 4 over. There you go. Keep going, keep going, keep going. There you go. So you see it right there. Okay. And then grows to, and then I assume that 1345 is the 1266 with the growth, the cushions in there going from the 11 to the 18. So
Correct.
1345 is what you're working with, right?
Correct. That's
your
adding the 10% increase in total fertility rate and crude.
So that's what you worked with on the 4 scenarios, correct? 1345.
That is accurate.
Okay, now go all the way to the left. What are those numbers that end up with 1186 in the fall of 2030? The 1186. So now what's that?
That is a 10% decrease.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, so we don't care about that. Okay, now can you go to the slides that just any of the 4 scenarios? Actually, go to the 4th one that has the least yellow in it, right? Okay, now why did you not also do this one with adding the grade to Trotter and decommissioning Woodward?
We could do that. We could. That's another scenario we could have looked at, Kathy.
And you know why I'm asking is because we have assumed in our committee that Woodward doesn't have a lot of room to grow, where of course Neary does. And so if what has to happen here is that Neary's got whatever that school is, here we're saying that Woodward has to grow, it looks like, right? To be able to do this.
Yep.
And so if it's Neary, we think Neary can grow better than Woodward. So that's why I'm asking you, why didn't you do the Neary? Okay, so that's fine.
I can add a 5th scenario. That's a good point.
All right, that's it for me.
Jason?
So Greg, thank you to you and your team. I know I can't probably estimate how long this took everyone to put together. So just kudos to all of you for continuing to advance the topic and, understand the bigger picture of what the town's looking at. I'm not going to repeat, obviously, my question I asked Bob earlier in the discussion, but would remind everyone that some of those yellow boxes turn green with even the slightest change in assumptions. Like some of those are yellow by a few numbers. So, I'm very interested in getting the answer on some of those items. But Greg, I think to you and your team, my question is sort of a follow-up to what Kamali said, but also an observation. What numbers are you using for FIN occupancy related to pre-K, related to students that reside in Northborough at the current point in time?
0.
Okay. Like that answer. And then I think more to Kamali's point, I would just remind everyone that I think the Finn parcel in particular, if we do have to tackle the universal pre-K discussion at some point sooner rather than later, is a flat parcel and is ripe for expansion if we had to go that route. So I would say any scenarios that we decide to run for universal pre-K, I think we're dealing with candidly a golden existing site there to, make it as seamless as possible if the need even existed. Because I think we all know that there's excess capacity that Northborough is occupying in that building right now. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there are still empty classrooms that are being used as extra space that wouldn't necessarily be quote unquote needed in a future state.
That is accurate. We have some luxury of using spaces in different ways as a result of current enrollment.
Okay, thank you.
Clayton, would you say that's accurate?
Greg, I would agree completely. Yes, we do have the luxury of that.
Kathy, is your hand still up or is it up?
No, no,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
It's
No.
okay. Kim?
My question is about the scenarios and why, or if you considered, instead of, are we adding to Trotter because there's this extra space? Or did you consider keeping Finn the same, adding to like whatever school, either Woodward or Neary, and then keeping Trotter the same? Oh, I'm mute.
Yeah, so I think what we were trying to demonstrate is that looking at our current facilities without any change, could we accommodate a shift? Could we decommission a school? One of the conversations that we're having with MSBA is, what potentially could the school look like? Could we, for example, and I'll use this as an example, can we build a 2 through 5 school?
Right.
So that's the work that we're waiting for MSBA to kind of invite us potentially into the eligibility process. And MSBA then would help us kind of look through what are the scenarios moving forward.
Okay. Thanks.
Greg, I have a question, which I guess it would be helpful to go back to. I think it's the bottom half of slide 4, which talks about the grade configuration key findings. And I either heard wrong or I read it wrong, or I may not understand. Even there's a third option I just don't understand. So I'm looking at my question is about transitions and the impact that transitions have on student performance, achievement, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that I heard you say when you got to the third bullet point that it does not impact, but then I wasn't really looking at the line. And then when I went back and looked at the line, I said, well, maybe I heard wrong. But then in the 5th bullet point, it says that it's the reverse, really.
Yeah.
That more transitions do result in decreased student achievement. So I'm just trying to reconcile those two bullets.
Yeah. So when we reviewed the literature, there was a body of literature that said that it does not impact, the number of transitions does not impact student performance and a family sense of community. And then we saw a body of research that basically stated that the number of transitions may result in decreased student achievement. And specifically, if you look at the detail of that body of research, what they show is that Usually the loss in student achievement is gained back in a third year. So if you have transition one, grade one, and then another transition to grade two, and then you transition to another school, what they're saying, if you have 3 grades together combined, so grade one, transition to grade two, transition to grade three, any loss of learning is made up in grade 3. So this body of research basically said that it does impact student achievement overall. So it contradicted the other body of research.
Well, I was worried that there was a confirmational bias issue here where I could just pick one, and depending on the result. All right. So the problem is with configurations that have 2 grades in each of the 3 elementary schools. Am I thinking about that correctly? Then none of in the current configuration, none of those schools ever get to a third grade in that school, or a chance to recover whatever it is was potentially lost in the transition.
You're either, we describe it as either welcoming students into your building and meeting new parents, or you're exiting students from your building and getting them prepared for a transition and kind of working with parents to get to the next school.
Okay, thank you. Kim.
Kind of piggybacking on that. I mean, Greg, you have experience leading a district with lots of transitions and a district without lots of transitions. So kind of what's your feeling on it? Like if you had to pick, would you pick less transitions?
I definitely would. I think the amount of resources, time, energy, and people that we spend on, making sure that, we do the transitions well for families and students is tremendous each year. In my experiences in other districts I've worked where there's been fewer transitions, you just spend less time doing it because kids are transitioning in the same school. Principals, teachers know the students and families, they've established those relationships, and they're not spending as much time building those relationships and spending time on transitions. So my preference would be fewer transitions for students.
Okay, great.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah, sorry to go again, but just maybe more of a prompt for Greg, because it's something he has told our subcommittee many times that I don't know that I heard strongly emphasized tonight, and just want to make sure that the logic still stands. Greg, I don't know if this is a question for you or Gary, but in all of the options, Trotter has a ton of space, no matter which way you cut it. And I think you've cautioned us pretty early on about moving grade 5 to Trotter. Leaving all the numbers off to the side, can you just speak to the group about the educational philosophy behind that and where your team stands on that currently before anyone spends a lot of time thinking about Trotter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I'll let the middle school experts speak, and Gary and Keith, who obviously spent many years at the middle school level, but just in terms of developmentally, 5th grade compared to an 8th grade, it's a significant developmental span that we don't think is necessarily in the best interest of 5th graders. But there are a variety of reasons, and Gary and I had some conversations earlier today. Gary, do you want to highlight some of the things we discussed?
I think, as Greg just pointed out, the 5th and 8th grade scenarios is one concern. Also, a middle school model versus an elementary school model is very different. One of the things that we have at the middle school is, multiple transitions throughout the course of a day. We find that even that transition for our 6th graders, is something we have to build up to. And our 6th graders have some difficulty moving into that model. So to present that middle school scenario to our 5th graders, we don't know it would be developmentally sound. Although and then as Mr. Martineau mentioned, although we do have classroom spaces, it's also at what cost. We currently have 3 special ed programs, in our schools that are really part of our community and part of the fabric of Trotter. Taking on another grade would require some negotiation about where these programs would fall and what they would look like. In addition, something I know, something as you would think would be pretty easily surmountable would be lunch waves. We would have to move, our cafeteria, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, probably could house about 200 at most, and that would be under, an ideal learning environment. Adding another grade would require probably a fourth lunch wave in some scenarios. And right now, our 8th graders are eating brunch at 10:30. So, that would be, that might cause us to look at programming throughout the day. Access to specials classes would also be, although we could take on, although we do have the space, getting 5th graders into, the gym, into the art room, into the music spaces could be done, but at what cost? Would that minimize, would that restrict the number of offerings our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders would have collectively? Keith, anything else? I know we've looked at this scenario in the past as well.
Yeah, we have, Gary, and I would agree with everything you stated, and I would absolutely confirm the cafeteria, just burrowing down to the logistics of that would be very challenging. So I would concur with everything you said.
Stephanie, if there's anything you would like to add.
About the middle school in particular?
Yeah.
And I think I would agree with everything that was said, and not a huge issue, but there can be teacher certification things, because middle school teachers are certified 5 through 12 usually, or 5 through 8, but elementary teachers are certified through 6th grade. So if you if any of our current teachers were moving to Trotter from 5th grade, they couldn't be used as 6th, 7th, or 8th grade teachers. Future hiring, you could say we're just going to hire 5 through 8, but our current teachers, then you would have very restricted staffing constraints around scheduling and things. So that's just one other small piece I would add.
I'm looking around for other hands. Don't see any. Greg?
No, I just, if there are no further questions, I think the purpose of the report is really to serve as a catalyst, for the school committee and the district, to gauge all stakeholders and thinking about, what are the potential opportunities. I think for us right now, we're really waiting to hear from MSBA to see if, we are invited into the eligibility period. And if we are invited into the eligibility period, there's a 270-day process that really vets all of the potential scenarios and the what if scenarios in much greater detail. So I think that is what we're waiting for in terms of hearing back from MSBA. And we'll continue to partner with the town of Southborough and the school research subcommittee to think about, if MSBA, we're not invited into MSBA, what are the options moving forward? I think Kim has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kim.
I just put it up. Can you just remind me if we are accepted into the MSBA, is that what does that mean? Are we getting that's the easiest question. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's multiple phases. So the eligibility phase is 270 days, and it requires us to do a feasibility study, go to the town to get the bonding and for the feasibility. And then at the 270 days, then the board, MSBA board, then evaluates our proposal and then invites us into the actual program. So I think it's just one more step, but it's not a guarantee that our project would be completely accepted.
And if if the board then accepted it, is it like, do they put money into money you already spent, or do they pay for anything?
We would
Or
then need to go to the voters to approve the overall project, and it's a reimbursement, so we would get Southborough's reimbursement of the project.
okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I guess
Well said.
I think that is it for the presentation, and I think we have some further questions to kind of evaluate and scenarios to look at, and I think Bob will touch base with Bob around some of the detailed questions that were asked this evening, and continue to move forward with this type of work.
Thank you.
Roger, do you want me to move to adjourn our meeting first?
Sure. I noticed that just to some folks who are attending, I noticed a message or two have come in. There really isn't a form here to deal with question and answer, but if you would, any questions you have about this, if you just send them to the school committee mailbox, we'll get a reply to folks. All right. So thank you for the interest. Why don't you go ahead and do that, Jason? Thank you.
I'll move that the Southborough Capital Planning School Research Subcommittee adjourn. Or second?
Second.
Roll call vote. Cook,
Aye.
Martin,
Aye.
and Malinowski is aye.
Good night, regular committee. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Jason,
Right.
thanks to you and your committee for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it was very beneficial, I think, for everyone. So I would also entertain motion to adjourn the special open meeting.
I'll
So
move to adjourn.
Where did it come from?
Tara.
Katura?
Yes.
All right, it's breaking up a little bit. So, and where did the second come from?
Kim.
Kim, all right. Sorry about that. All right, so it's been moved by Katura, seconded by Kim to adjourn the special open meeting of the Southborough School Committee at 7:44 p.m. Roll call vote. Katura,
Yes.
Jen,
Yes.
Kim,
Yes.
Kamali.
yes.
I vote yes. We are adjourned. Thank you very much. This was